Canal Street. It was used to drain a fresh body of water that was in the middle of the island of Manhattan. The body of water got so terribly smelly and derelict and filled with filth that they had to drain it. However, we talk about the negative side of Collect Pond's history, but we rarely talk about who lived around it. Yes, we know about the gangs of 5 Points, Irish Americans coming in, flooding into this new nation, seeking out a new life, a new start. But there were people here who were subjugated, who were forgotten, that came way before even the Irish or the Italians or the Germans or countless other ethnicities, even my own, Puerto Ricans. Today we're going to learn the forgotten past of African Americans here in Lower Manhattan, starting at Canal Street, because we're only a mere block away from a very important location. I'm Ariel, this is Urbanist, and let's explore the forgotten history of African Americans here in New York City. Right now we're starting at Mulberry Street and Canal Street, and Canal Street, as I mentioned, is named after a canal. Nowadays, this is known as Chinatown. However, the origins of Chinatown actually enlighten us on to why the historic reason, why this land was always part of the ostracized communities of New York. Originally, what we would be looking here instead of Chinatown and the high rises of New York City Civil District was the bucolic lands of Collect Pond. This would be our view right now. Now the thing is, with Collect Pond being a fresh body of water, the surrounding areas, especially the northern area, was very swampy. And being swampy, it was undesirable land to construct and to live in. This gave a perfect opportunity for the men and women who were brought over here in bondage from Western Africa, across the Atlantic Ocean, enslaved by first the Dutch and then later the British, to build the infrastructure of New York. This would be the only place they could really live in. But it looked way different back then. And this park is one of the very few reminders of the past of New York City, dating back to the 1600s. This is Columbus Park. And Columbus Park destroyed the neighborhood of 5 Points. But before then, this was landfill. 1811, Collect Pond was starting to be drained, filled up, covered up with trash that was found around the city in order to make up new land that could be developed. The only people who decided to come over here at first were the African Americans. Nowadays, this is Columbus Park. So heads up, this broadcast is going to be of a sensitive topic, and the words we might use also might be sensitive as well, and viewer discretion is advised, since we'll be talking about the terrible past of America and its dealings with slavery. In 1626, the Dutch West India Company, also known as the VOC, brought over here 11 men from West Africa. They were from the Congo, from Angola, from other parts in West Africa, and they were brought over here as the very first slaves to set foot into New York City. They were used to build the very first town of New Amsterdam that would grow and grow into a bustling commercial center of North America. However, under Dutch rule, the slaves that were brought here could get what was called half freedom. Half freedom meant that they could petition to be let loose of their duties full time. However, if the town or the city ever needed their services, aka building buildings or infrastructure or landfilling more of the water, they would be called to service and they would have to do it. I would think unpaid. So those men and the families that they end up having afterwards, and the more men that were brought over here and then later women, they end up settling down with their half freedom outside of the boundaries of New Amsterdam because they couldn't settle within New Amsterdam. They had to go right north of it. And also they didn't have money to develop land maybe far up north because there was no trains. There was probably very little money or resources to take any boats or ferries. So the easiest place to do so was right north of Collect Pond, right where we're standing over here. It was very swampy land. It was a place where they could be left alone, at least for a while, until the British came. Hello, Alexandra. Yes, this is not Seneca Village. Merhaba, Belgian. Milo, welcome. Kay, E. Sunshine, and Spencer, and Milo. Marina, welcome. Dave, Katya, nice to see you here. And Susu, hello. So let's walk through this park. Now this is what used to be called 5 Points. And after, well, actually let's go a little bit further back. In 1655, the very first slave auction was held at the bottom of Wall Street, right by the East River. There's actually a placard that was installed just a few years ago, but here's an image, a depiction of what was the case back then. So the Dutch had the very first slave auction over here, and you might think slavery was mostly a big deal in the southern US. Not quite the case. All the way till about the early 1800s, New York City was actually the second highest slave-owning city in the entire United States, only after Charleston, South Carolina. So then in 1664, the English took over New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. And with that brought a new rule to when it came to slaves. They no longer could get their so-called half freedom that the Dutch granted them. Slaves were slaves. They could be freed, but there were no protections in terms of them being captured and being sent to the South, or them being captured or sent to the Caribbean. There were no protections in them not being beaten. So life under British rule for the Africans was quite terrible. And thus, it was even more important for them to make a living and build out some type of community here in the outskirts of Collect Pond. A few of them actually end up getting farms, and they started moving more uptown, all the way until right above, below the base of the Empire State Building. There was a farm owned by an African ex-slave. But by 1703, 42% of households here in British New York had slaves. And by the 1740s, over 2,500 slaves were here, and that skyrocketed to 10,000 by 1780. So this ties into 5 Points, because when we start going to the 1830s or so, 5 Points was being flooded to the brim with Irish immigrants fleeing the issues that were happening in their home country with famine, which is a very complicated issue. It's definitely an entire episode on its own. And let's crisscross around here. So we're walking right outside the Civic Center. We're mostly sticking to this area. So a lot of the Irish that were moving here, they were moving into 5 Points along with the Africans that were already here. By that time, there were already African Americans because they've been here for a few generations. So the Irish, for a historical perspective, were seen as the lowest of the low. A lot of the Americans here who were Anglo-Saxon Protestant that were descendants of Englishmen or maybe Scottishmen had the same sentiments that the English had against the Irish. Saw them as the lowest of the low of society. It was a great excuse for the English because it helped them subjugate or justify, within quotes, the subjugation of Ireland. Well, same thing happened here. And the Irish thus decided to move to a place where they could, something very cheap, some place where they can afford it, and they wouldn't be bothered as much as trying to encroach on white Protestant land. So they moved along with the African Americans, in the neighborhood of 5 Points. And the very interesting thing is, in the very early days of 5 Points, there was an actual intermingling. There was reports of a few families coming together. So African-Irish families starting up. And also, we can see it today with the tradition of tap dancing. And tap dancing is a combination of African influences with Irish influences. And it's something very famous, especially during the Harlem Renaissance of the 1900s. But what happened? Why don't we see Irish African families anymore? That much, at least. Or why don't we see neighborhoods that are fully integrated? Why are the suburbs not integrated in New York City? Well, for that we have to go in 1863, July. The Civil War was in full force, and the Union Army was running out of soldiers. The Unions were the North, here, this area. The South was fighting for its rights, state rights. Those state rights was the right to hold slaves and to continue the institution of slavery. The North was fighting to maintain the Union at all costs. Well, running out of soldiers, they decided to enact a draft. And the draft would be chosen at random, with any man who's between, I think, the ages of 17 or so, all the way to about 35. Whether you're in a family or not, you have to be enlisted in a draft, rich or poor. But there was one caveat. You can pay $300 to be exempted from that draft. So what happens? Well, the poor Irishmen that come all the way over here from escaping persecution, escaping famine, escaping all these horrible hardships that they were experiencing across the Atlantic, suddenly come over here and find themselves that they have to fight a war that they're not fully invested in. Especially because both the Irish and the African Americans were competing for the same jobs. Those jobs were building the early stages of Central Park, or the very first bridges that were popping up in New York City, or maybe the telegraph poles and the water systems, and etc. Most of the grunt work, and they were competing for the same jobs. Thus, the Irish started seeing the African Americans as competition. And once they started seeing them as competition, they were pissed off that they had to be drafted into a war to fight for their freedom. Now, this is a simplification of these riots because they're a lot more complicated and a lot more stuff was involved in this. But with the combination of rich people being able to buy their freedom from the draft, and with the competition that was happening between the lower classes, this ignited a huge riot.
I have not learned anything.
So this riot consumed the entire city. Men started attacking buildings. This was one of the bars that was attacked by the mobs. The mobs were mostly consistent of Irish Americans, gangs, and also the white Protestants were joining in for the fun as well. So it was an all-out battle. And they were picking out African Americans that they would see in the street and capture them. However, it's very sad because as they would be capturing them, they would take them and lynch them on the tree. Many men lost their lives that day who were African American. Many others lost their lives when the militia was brought in to clamp down on the riots. It's one of the largest riots to ever happen in American history. The largest riot to ever happen in American history. This is depicted indeed in the gangs of New York. Highly recommend watching it. Here's another depiction of it. But the most heinous thing that happened, I think, in the entire Civil War draft riots was that the mob, in its fury and its anger against the African American community, went up to the New York, and I'm going to use this word that they used back then. It's no longer in use today, but they called it the New York Colored Orphan Asylum. They went up and burned it to the ground. Luckily, most of the children inside the asylum managed to escape, except for one little girl who died burning in the fire. Another thing that is a little bit forgotten is that there was a propaganda campaign of sorts with more of the rich white Protestant community who did not want the African Americans and the Irish to continue commingling. They saw that as a threat. I wouldn't think so much as a racial threat, though it's my own speculation. I think it was more they were seen as a political threat or an economic threat, especially with these two large communities coming together. And thus, there was also dissent already forming right before then. So right before the Civil War draft riots in 1863, the mayor of New York, Fernando Wood, is this guy over here, he actually wanted to secede from the Union, the North, and actually join the Confederacy. But why? Why did he want to join the Confederacy? He wasn't just a madman mayor. People actually agreed with him. Businesses here in New York City agreed with him. Because the thing is, Fernando Wood knew that the power, the financial might of New York City with some of the largest banking firms, some of the largest jewelry firms, some of the largest garment firms were dependent on the low or the no cost of labor from down south. They made way more profits by not paying anything for labor. New York City was constructed a lot with the money made from the slaves down south. Fernando Wood knew this, and that's why he wanted to join the Confederacy. Luckily, he wasn't reelected, and luckily, that wasn't the sentiment following the Civil War draft riots. So here we are in what's called the New York City Civic Center. And this area was also part of Collect Pond. So let me show you the extent of Collect Pond before we move forward. We have two stops here. This was Collect Pond, and part of this was also underwater. And to this day, you will see parts of this area still flood. Now it's filled with a lot of governmental buildings, the U.S. Supreme Court, there's the state office building, there is the IRS. A lot of buildings are centered around here for the core of New York City and U.S. government. But remember, this is what we would be looking at back in the 1700s. Those men building the Empire State Building were Irish? Yeah, there was a combination of Irish and Mohawk Native Americans, mostly. There probably was people from many other parts, but African Americans later in the construction boom of the 1900s, I don't think were really involved, especially in the late 1800s all the way to about the 1940s. We're not so heavily involved in construction. I think even to just a decade or two ago. Thank you, Steve, for the 50 stars. I appreciate you. Joe says, I'm near your old work, 125th 4th Street. Text New York City, African American clients. I don't think it was on behalf of the city. I think it was behalf of an entrepreneur. So here we have the courtrooms. You might recognize this from shows like Law and Order and Blue Bloods. Here's an example of the constant flooding that happens. That's why water truly never goes away. Let's go out through here. Hey, Samantha, you got married here. Oh, cool. Yeah. This is also the place where you would get married as well. Joy, thank you so much for 100 stars. And Lorraine dropping knowledge this morning. Yes, indeed. So here we have a sculpture called The Triumph of the Human Spirit, built by Lorenzo Pace back in the year 2000. This is in the form of antelope headdress that was used by the Bambara people. The Bambara people are located in the area of Timbuktu, which I'll show you right here. Timbuktu, that was mostly the Bambara civilization. And then the figures were called Chimiwara. It's a little bit hard to pronounce. But it's in the form of an antelope. So why was this built? Well, for one very important reason we're going to learn right over here with this huge building. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. But this is what's called Foley Square. Let's take a look around it. Well, one part of the history of slavery, and slavery has been existing before written record, before history, in essence. But we're mostly talking about what's called the Atlantic slave trade. And more than 11 to 12 million people were carted over here from ships all throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. People who are in my family as well, being Puerto Rican as well. And the thing is, one part of that history that is not really well talked about, especially in America, are the rebellions. Because the rebellions are kind of snuffed out of history, at least here. We know about Haiti. Many people know, at least it's in many historical textbooks, but not so much about what happened here in America. Well, one of the larger slave rebellions that happened was in 1712. 1712, 23 enslaved Africans got loose from their bondage and murdered 9 people. The city at that time reacted very strongly, arrested more than 70 individuals, convicted 20-something of them, and executed them. A few of them were burnt at the stake. So, this already scared New Yorkers from potential slave rebellion. But nothing happened for many, many years. Maybe smaller incidents, but nothing large. Let's zoom in all the way to 1741. 1741, it is one of the coldest winters in New York City history. People say that the Hudson River was completely frozen. Houses were frozen, the infrastructure was frozen, people couldn't get grain, so the bakeries laid empty. People were starving for food, including the African Americans who lived out here in this area around Collect Pond. They were also freezing. Now, when people are freezing and in close quarters, they put on fires. They put on bonfires, or they put on candles all around just to stay a little bit warm. Fires started breaking out all throughout the city. However, people were afraid that these fires were intentional. And fires started breaking out even in one of the quarters of the British officials. For a guy's name, Philip George or something like that. And it broke out in his mansion as well. And New Yorkers were afraid that this was a slave rebellion. There was a little girl who blamed one of the Africans who apparently she said that was running away from the scene. And she yelled, "Negro, Negro, Negro." All of a sudden, a huge roundup of all the Africans started taking place. 300 people were stuffed into the dungeons of the New York City jail because they all thought they were implicated. New York City received a letter. One of the justices received an anonymous letter. It seemed to be coming from New England, and he says, "Watch out, this happened in 1692, just a few decades ago. It happened, and it was with the Salem witch trials." Well, those men were rounded up. Over 100 were convicted. They were exiled, sold back to slavery to go back to the Caribbean. And then 13 of them were burnt at the stake. As gruesome, as terrible, as horrendous as even the Salem witch trials as well. This is where they were burnt at the stake, right here. So this is what we would be looking at, aerial view. Hey, how's it going?
Hello, this is going to be a protest right
What?
now?
I'm busy right now, unfortunately. Yeah. This is an aerial view of what you would see of the area that we're looking at right now. Now, what is there in the center? Well, that was discovered in 1991. And let's go to our final stop over here. So 1991, the US government, federal government, wanted to build a massive building for the Environmental Protection Agency, the IRS, which is the Internal Revenue Service, and a few other offices of the federal government. The building was actually supposed to be much larger than this one that we see now today. But in 1991, as they were doing the construction and surveying the land, because by contract, every single construction project in the city has to provide a proof that it's environmentally safe to build the structure, they found skeletons. They kept on digging and found even more skeletons. Now, skeletons have been found in New York City all the time, like in Washington Square Park. I mentioned it many times. Many thousands of people are buried underneath. In 1888, there was a huge, in the 1860s, there was a massive construction project where the A.T. Stewart department store also found skeletons. But they covered it up, basically said nothing about it, and it was forgotten. However, things were different in 1991. People wanted to know who they belonged to. A feeling who they were. They ended up finding out more than 419 skeletons. They petitioned the mayor, Dinkins, at the time, New York City's first African American mayor, to halt construction. The president, George H.W. Bush, also gave the sign-off. And they ceased construction and excavated the bodies. These were some of the bodies found. These were what was called historically the Negro burying ground. This is where the African American community lived. And this is where they buried their dead. Now, many people for many years thought this was a potter's field. And a potter's field is basically a place where unknown people or people who are too poor to afford a burial site are just buried en masse. Someone just mentioned earlier, who was it? Max Headroom mentioned 1 million people are buried in Hart Island. Yeah, Washington Square Park has 20,000 people potentially buried, also a potter's field. This is not a potter's field. These were intentional burials done by the community, who was pretty settled in this area for many, many decades. They were starting to build churches, they were starting to build schools, they had education. This was their burying site. Burying them in the traditions that they had coming over from Africa, which was a different combination of traditions, because people came from different parts of West Africa that we can see over here. Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, Benin, the Congo, Angola. Now, the rediscovery of the burial ground revealed that Africans and their descendants buried loved ones with dignity and respect in the 17th and 18th century. More than 90% of the 419 skeletal remains were wrapped in shrouds, which are the cloths that people usually wrap dead bodies in. And most of the bodies were buried in full-size coffins, so this was no potter's field. This was no random burial ground like the Hart Iden or Washington Square Park. Africans continued other traditional practices such as placing pennies over eyes to keep them closed. Small artifacts like beads, cowrie shells, and cufflinks sometimes accompanied the burials. But then community activists petitioned the city to stop. See over here. So this, in 2007, was dedicated as the African Burial Ground National Monument. And we're gonna walk. It's considered sacred land, and hopefully we can walk through it. It seems to be open. And there's a little bit more history here about Africans in New York City. So here they say African American workers positioned hollowed out pine log pipes in trench along Broad Street. The 25-mile pipeline formed the city's first municipal water system in the early 1800s. Laborers tore up the cobblestone streets, dug trenches, laid and joined pipe sections, and filled the trenches. All right, let's go into the memorial. So one interesting thing about the skeletal remains is that a huge portion were children, and it showed the very high mortality rate for children in this area with the African community. The second thing is they found that a lot of the adults who were only about 20 to 30 years old had arthritis, had torn ligaments, also had fractures in the back of their skull. But why is that? Why does a 20 or 30 something have these conditions? Well, it was due to the very heavy, intense labor. The labor was so intense that it gave them arthritis early. And they also found evidence of influenza, polio, smallpox, and other diseases that were also ravaging this community due to the poor health standards that they experienced, especially when being shipped over to America. The back of the skull was because some of the laborers usually carried heavy stones or whatnot, or heavy materials on their head, and it would cause pressure on their skulls and would fracture sometimes part of the skull. Here we have the people buried right now. They're still here. These mounds. And they have some guidebooks and guide. Oh, out of focus. There we go. So we're gonna see it. Oh, they're closed? Oh, can I see it really quickly? Just in 1 minute? Yeah, just 1 minute. Thank you. Appreciate it. So here it is. Beautiful. Let me show it real quickly. Ah, they're closed. Oh my God. They close so early. And all the different religious symbols and such. And it's meant to look like the hull of a ship. Awesome, thank you. What time do you guys usually close?
On the clothes, man. Anytime that's like we got special events or
Oh.
something like that, or trying to have this nice weather, things like that.
Oh, okay.
You know, trying to make sure that get the ice melt.
Yeah, that makes sense, man. Thank you so much for letting me see it. All right, let me show it from afar. So there in the front it says, "For all those who were lost, for all those who were stolen, for all those who were left behind, for all those who are not forgotten." So the entire thing is meant to look like a hull of a ship. At least this part is meant to look like a hull of a ship. And they had all the different religious symbols of the different faiths that they have found that they were believing. I think there's like a faith called Ashanti. They found out that there's many people who are part of the faith of Islam. There was many different faiths down there. So this is sacred ground. And here we have the building. And inside the building there's a few works of African American artists, because along with making this national monument, they got into agreement to make works for African American artists all around the building. And here's a few others. I have a few photos. Gene, thank you so much for the compliment. Here's a reconstructed facial reconstruction of a few of the people who are buried right over here in the mounds. And this is where the burial ground was located, right outside the outskirts of Collect Pond. So we're no longer walking on top of what used to be Collect Pond. And this is the site, how it looked like back in 1991. And here we see the different grading. How far below? So we see about 25 feet goes below, and we see the coffins going below 15 feet, which is pretty low, dating back to the 1700s. And for the different paintings, let me see if I can pull up a few. Here's one of them. And we can see another one over here. I think we'll be able to peek through a few others. So I'm kind of bummed that I can't go inside the memorial. This has happened to me way too many times. I hope they figure out this memorial thing, because I've only been able to go inside at peace only once. It is very early. So I'm surprised that they're closing this early. So I'm a little bit saddened. I was afraid that this would happen again. Yeah, I'm not sure why the memorial always closes. He says that it's because of the snow, and you have to. They have maybe an event coming in, something along those lines. I don't know. It's kind of a shame. It's one of the few memorials that I've always had a difficulty getting into. And it's sad that that's the case. It's like right in the middle of Manhattan. But let's see if we can see a few of the other artworks. They have a research library inside here. Why is the caskets bumped up in the grass? I don't fully know, Clara. That's a great question. I don't know. I think it might be due to some tradition of green burials, I think they call it in Africa, in parts of Africa. And I'm using Africa as a catch-all term. I do realize it is thousands upon thousands of different cultures. But the West Africans that came here, they did have a tradition of called green burials, as far as I know. So that might be it. We can't really see much of the other artworks. There's one here on the floor. Let's see if we can catch this one. And they have here. So made by different African American artists. And they have a few placards about the history of the actual burial ground. Well, it's I'm glad he was able to let me show it for like a minute. It's nice. I hope you enjoyed it. These are the forgotten areas of African American history here in Lower Manhattan. As far as I know. After that, if you want to know very briefly, due to the Civil War draft riots, African Americans started moving further and further uptown. They started moving to places like Seneca Village and then later into Harlem. But also this is the Civil War draft riots is the one reason why African Americans started moving towards Brooklyn, specifically to Weeksville. I have a very old video on the old houses, the historic houses of Weeksville, which are one of the very best preserved early African American residences in New York City, and the modern day area of Bedford-Stuyvesant as we know today as well. So I hope you enjoyed this tour, and I hope this gives you a little bit more curiosity into exploring this type of history for yourself. Beyond the sad history of the 1700s with this community, I think it's also important to recognize how deeply important African American culture has been to the US and to the world, with countless different things, from music, television, movies, comedy, art, etc. The list goes on. Poetry, sports, the list goes on. Has a massive, massive, gigantic impact on every single type of culture that we know that has made the US great and known all around the world. I'm Ariel, this is Urbanist. Thank you so much for watching. Keep being awesome and always keep on exploring. Have a great day, everyone. Have a good day.